All right, everybody. I'm sure you know this song. Go ahead and sing with me. Ready? One, two, three. Old MacDonald had a farm. You know that one? Go ahead. E-I-E-I-O. You've heard of that, right? Old MacDonald had a farm. You ready? How about this one? Have you ever heard of this? Old MacDonald had an apartment house. What? Old MacDonald had an apartment house? What's that all about? Well, let's find out. Old MacDonald had an apartment house. That's not as catchy as maybe Old MacDonald had a farm, but we'll give it a shot. This is Old MacDonald Had an Apartment House, and it is written by Judith Barrett and illustrated by Ron Barrett. Now, you might know who these two people are when you see this story. Now, the AR test for this is 25, 28, 3, and it's a level 4.0, so it's a little bit higher, 4th grade level, but here we go. Old MacDonald had an apartment house. It says dedicated to all children everywhere, even those who hate vegetables. Old MacDonald had an apartment house. Old MacDonald lived in a big apartment house with his wife and their dog. They didn't own the building. Fat Mr. Rental did. Old MacDonald was the super. That means he's a superintendent. He takes care of things in the apartment building. He polished the brass doorknobs when they got smudgy, and mopped up the hallways when they got dirty, and sent up steam when it got cold. And Old MacDonald's apartment was on the bottom floor, and it was very dark. The windows were covered by a thick, bushy hedge that grew in the front yard. Without sunlight, his wife's tomato plant grew pale and droopy. Oh, poor tomato plant. So, Old MacDonald decided to cut down the hedge in front of the windows. When all the sunlight came in, the plant straightened up and grew a few leaves and even a few tomatoes. But the spot where the hedge had been looked very empty. So, Old MacDonald's wife suggested that they fill it with her tomato plant. And they did. It grew lots of new leaves, many more tomatoes, and much taller. "Why not get rid of all the rest of the hedge?" Old MacDonald said. "Then, instead, I could plant vegetables in the yard. They're better looking than a hedge and much better tasting, too." So he cut the whole hedge down to the ground, and in its place he planted rows of corn and melons and beans and radishes. The fountain became a self-watering pea patch. The front yard had become a small farm, and the tenants were amazed. The tenants are the people that live in the building. One of the tenants, Mrs. Katz, really didn't need 4 rooms anymore. Her children were grown up, so she moved out. It occurred to Old MacDonald that an empty apartment would be a good place to grow lots more vegetables, and he quickly moved in some soil and proceeded to redecorate in the late vegetarian style. He laid down a carpet of carrots and cabbages, put some sweet potatoes where the couch had been, and stuffed the closet with mushrooms. Some days later, Mrs. Katz's downstairs neighbor, Mr. Hopkins, turned on a faucet and got hot and cold running sweet potato vines. Above his head, he could see carrots popping through the ceiling. He became furious. "Either that garden goes up there, or I go," he screamed at Old MacDonald. But Old MacDonald really didn't care. He'd begun to feel that in some ways vegetables were much better tenants than people. Carrots don't smudge brass doorknobs. Cucumbers don't leave muddy footprints in the hall. And potatoes don't bang on the radiators for more steam. Angry Mr. Hopkins moved out. A variety of vegetables, a field of clover, and a cow moved in. No one knew what Old MacDonald was doing, but you can't keep a cow secret for very long. More and more people moved out, very disgusted with what was happening. So, more vegetables, trees, cows, and chickens took their place. Finally, every tenant in the building had moved out. The apartment house became a 4-story farm. And then, one day, Fat Mr. Rental, the owner, stopped by and checked on the house to collect the rent money, as he did every few months. When he saw that his tenants had been replaced by vegetables, fruit trees, cows, chickens, he got very upset. Very upset. "Look here, old MacDonald. What have you done?" he shouted. "Where are the families? All that's here now are bushels of fruits and vegetables and herds of cows and flocks of chickens, and they can't pay me rent." Old MacDonald and his wife were very sad. They knew they would have to leave. Fat Mr. Rental told them so. In fact, he was going to have the whole farm thrown out into the street. Old MacDonald told his wife not to cry near her tomato plant because the salt water wouldn't be good for it. Besides, it would set a bad example for the cows. Fat Mr. Rental paced back and forth quickly in front of the house. He was very upset and not really sure that he liked the idea of throwing the farm out into the street. Old MacDonald had been such a good super. Now, not only was he without tenants, but he'd be without a super, too. Who ever heard of a farm in the middle of the city? That's absurd," he muttered. "Or is it? Maybe a farm could pay me rent after all." The next morning, old MacDonald and his wife stepped outside the house carrying their suitcases, and in the middle of the front walk, Fat Mr. Rental was building a store. There was a big sign that read, "Rental and MacDonald's fruits and vegetables, fresh milk and eggs hourly." Fat Mr. Rental waved at old MacDonald and shouted, "Where are you going, partner? You grow the stuff and I'll sell it. Vegetables will pay me rent after all." On opening day, the store was jammed. Fat Mr. Rental made a very long speech in which he asked everyone to come in very often and buy as much as they could. He asked old MacDonald to say a few words, and he did. And he said, "People, I'm happy to have such fine vegetables as tenants. I hope you agree that good vegetables make good neighbors." The people applauded and then began to buy as much as they could, and they came back day after day. Both the store and the farm thrived throughout the summer and fall. And even in winter, when the earth outside was frozen and covered with snow, things were still growing on the steam-heated farm. Judith and Ron Barrett both grew up in apartment houses in New York City. They're married to each other. Ron spends 5 days a week as an art director at an advertising agency, while Judith teaches art to children and is working towards a master's degree in early childhood education. The closest thing in their apartment to an apple tree is a scrawny 4-foot pit-grown avocado tree. The most reasonable facsimile of a chicken is their parakeet, and the only vegetables that they have are in their refrigerator. Old MacDonald had an apartment house. And again, the number is 25283.